Topsfield Garden Club, the Topsfield Historical Society, and I'm chairman of the planning board. And because I have something to do with all of the groups that organized this event this evening, I got chosen to speak. So, on behalf of everyone, we welcome you this evening. Our speaker this evening has over 20 years of experience in preservation studies and consulting. She worked as Newton's preservation planner for 10 years and taught in the Boston University Preservation Studies program for 7. Gretchen has also been involved in the trenches in her own town of Wayland on the planning board and the Historic District Commission, all of the stuff that so many of us are familiar with. If there were a designation friend of Topsfield, Gretchen would be the first to earn it because she's been involved in all of our preservation activities, most specifically the Farms and Rural Retreats project that the Historical Commission organized over a number of years, a groundbreaking project for the town that led ultimately to a new National Register district, and we have information on that here. And also Gretchen worked on our Essex Heritage Landscape Survey project, so has been involved in so many of our preservation activities. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Gretchen Schuler, who is going to speak with us tonight about our wonderful rural and historic heritage.
If there's someone who's technologically really savvy, speak up, because all of these, if you can see the color on the computer, it's a totally different color than what's up here. And apparently you can adjust the projector, but I don't know how to do that for color, because those are blue letters on my text. Thank you, Martha. Thank you very much. I won't bother to tell you again about all of the projects that I have been so fortunate to participate in Topsfield. But before I start, I do want to publicly thank Elizabeth Mulholland. She has been such an inspiration, so willing, has provided such amount of information, and she just gets the job done. And I've been able to work with her on the Farms and Rural Retreat project, and also the Heritage Landscape project. She was your local project coordinator for the town of Topsfield, and that was a program that's being administered by the state, and we're still working on that in Topsfield. We're looking at Route 1. So thank you, Liz. So tonight we're going to explore the wonderful land use pattern that has led to the preservation of much of Topsfield's fine rural character. We're going to talk about architects and landscape architects brought to Topsfield by out-of-towners to shape these country retreats, and there will be constant reference to the Essex Agricultural Society, established in 1818 and central to the farms and rural retreats in Topsfield from that time forward. Should we try to turn out one more light, and maybe that'll change the color? It's getting there. That's fine. Is that fine with you? And the other thing too is shout out if I'm not speaking loudly enough, because I'm not using the microphone. Can everybody hear me? Is that all right? Okay. Fine. Thank you. Clearly, preservation of your rural character is a guiding principle, as we are reminded every time we enter Topsfield. This sign just begins to prepare us for the treats in store as we travel through your town. The rural roads are important complementary features that lead to the rural retreats. Route 1, the Newburyport Turnpike, laid out as a toll road in 1804 and operated as the stage route, cut a straight line through town, the most direct route possible, connecting Newburyport to the north and Boston to the south. It retains its stone walls, its single travel lane in each direction, and its topography as it traverses the hills and valleys of your town. Perkins Road, with its stone arch bridge, is a narrow scenic road, and of course River Road also is beloved for its stone walls, tree canopy, and fine vistas across the meadows. And then there are many other rural views that are part of the farms and the rural retreat story. The marshland of the Ipswich River, or the cart path across the agricultural fields and leading down to the river. The natural landscape, the rivers, the hills, the valleys, are what has shaped this town. So let's begin by looking at some of the early dwellings that were surrounded by farmland and that retained much of their 17th, 18th, and 19th century settings. At the northwest corner of River Road and Prospect Street is the Zacchaeus Gould House, which started as a single-cell structure circa 1670. That means one room deep, and was enlarged by the addition of the rooms on the left side of the now central chimney in circa 1700. This house is at the center of Lake Village and surrounded by lake farms. The lake farms comprise land on both sides of River Road. The late 17th to early 18th century Stanley Lake House, there. Sorry, it's off the screen a little bit. So named for the Stanleys, from whom the first Eleazar Lake had purchased land and a small building, and the Eleazar Lake House, the white one here, which was built in 1808, front on River Road. The fourth generation Lake built the 19th century house and farmed the family land, and was succeeded by his son, Eleazar Lake Jr. This fifth generation Lake was a farmer and a shoemaker who likely used the shoe shop, which you see here on the bottom, between the two houses. The area was known as Lake Village. We will return to this area for more on mid-19th century developments. But before we go on, let me just point out the Lake Barn, which is listed on the National Register as all these properties in the Lake and Cross and Prospect Street area are, I'm sorry, the River Road area are. But that is a very important barn because it is a first period barn of early construction. Over on the eastern side of town, one of the earliest farms was that of Matthew Peabody, who owned his Salem Road farm from 1736 to 1777. The house is likely to have preceded Matthew Peabody by many years, as Samuel Boyd occupied a house at this location as early as 1720. One of Peabody's sons, John Peabody, who owned half of this house by 1768 and the rest following the death of his parents in 1777, was proprietor of 112 acres with this house. As the house passed to succeeding generations, the land was divided, and by the 1860s, when it was sold out of the Peabody family to James Waters, only 12 acres accompanied the house and a barn. The old barn burned, and Waters had John H. Potter, local carpenter, construct a new barn in 1875, hence the existing structure. And we're going to encounter John H. Potter over and over and over again. The first rural retreat in Topsfield was developed in the early 19th century when Captain Thomas Perkins, who lived in Salem, inherited his father's farm in Topsfield and set out to build a high-style country residence. Although Perkins had been born in a small farmhouse no longer extant on his father's property and trained as a cordwainer, he had gone to Salem and shipped out on a privateer in circa 1770. In the 1780s, he met his future business partner, Joseph Peabody, aboard a ship. Together, they amassed a sizable fortune as merchants with a large fleet of sailing vessels that traveled between Salem and the West Indies. Upon the death of his father in 1807, Thomas Perkins found that his newly inherited property was a place in the country where he could pursue his farming interests away from his permanent residence in Salem. He hired Topsfield carpenter builder Samuel Hood to build his finely articulated federal house. The federal architecture in Salem clearly influenced Perkins' taste. Besides the handsome exterior, some of the interior work demonstrated the strong influence of Samuel McIntyre in the Adamesque embellishments. Perkins reportedly expanded his farm to incorporate progressive agricultural practices of the day and was a founding member of the Essex Agricultural Society in 1818. His former business partner, Joseph Peabody, was pursuing similar interests in nearby Danvers, where in 1814 he had purchased a country retreat, now known as Glen Magna, consisting of an orchard, meadowland, and a house large enough for 2 families. Although Perkins continued to live in Salem, in his later years he spent much of his time at his Topsfield farm, which upon his death passed to Perkins' nephew, Asa Pingree II, who was the son of Thomas Perkins' sister, and the sister's name was Anna Perkins Pingree. Just as an aside, Asa's older son, David Pingree, had followed his uncle into the shipping business and had been very successful. So he inherited the shipping business of his uncle, and Asa inherited the Topsfield farm. We're going to come up against him again, so that's why I'm making that genealogy more specific. In 1836, Pingree constructed the Greek Revival side gable farmhouse for his mother. Here's the white one next to the Federal House. Asa made other improvements to the property, but the only extant outbuilding constructed during his proprietorship is the unique stone stable or carriage house situated just southeast of what now is referred to as the Pingree Mansion. Constructed of fieldstone from Crooked Pond in Boxford, the 1850 stable replaced a chaise house that was destroyed by fire the year before. Now, at the height of Asa Pingree's farming career, he held nearly 150 acres and, of course, plenty of livestock, a pair of oxen, 5 swan, and several dairy cows from which he produced butter. He owned orchards and planted his field with oats, potatoes, and hay. And unlike his uncle, from whom he had inherited this property, Asa Pingree made the farm his primary residence. He was highly influential in Topsfield, one of the wealthiest citizens in the 1850s. He served as a selectman in the 1840s, was a founder of the New Methodist Church, which broke away from the original Congregational Church, and he was a founder of the Danvers and Georgetown Railroad, which opened in 1854. In addition, he was an active member of the Essex Agricultural Society. You'll probably hear that a few more times tonight. During his ownership, Asa Pingree expanded the farm holdings to include the broad meadow across the street from the farmstead and from the mansion, a piece of land fondly remembered in the 20th century as Sledding Hill, where locals recalled sliding down to the Ipswich River in snowy winters. He also added large sweeps of land on the east side of the Newburyport Turnpike, known as Pingree's Hill, and meadows southwest of the farmstead, bordering on Hill Street, that eventually became part of Meredith Farm on Cross Street. Upon his death in 1869, Asa Pingree left the Salem Road farm and all the related land holdings to his nephew, David Pingree II, son of his brother, David. Like his great uncle, Thomas Perkins, this new proprietor made his primary residence in Salem while carrying on extensive progressive farming operations on his Topsfield farm. He was a longtime member of the Essex Agricultural Society, won several prizes at the annual fair in the early 1900s in plowing and farm horse categories. Now, 2 buildings remain on the property from David Pingree's second's ownership: the late 19th century carriage house, which is next to the small farmhouse that's close to the road. It was built for his grandmother, and the large New England barn constructed in circa 1907, which is back towards the back of the property. When David Pingree II died in 1932, after more than 60 years as owner of the Salem Road farm, it passed to his grandnephew, David Pingree Weedman. So it's nephew, 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 grandnephew, who owned it into the 1980s. In 1821, Benjamin Crowninshield, one of the 4 powerful Crowninshield brothers of the family firm which owned the second largest fleet in Salem, purchased the old Esty farm that straddled the Newburyport Turnpike. And when we turn the lights back on, the much better prints of these are up here for you to look at. They're absolutely wonderful to look at the detail on these. Like his neighbor, Thomas Perkins, Crowninshield transformed the old colonial farm into a stylish and comfortable country seat. With the assistance of a resident farm manager, he turned his nearly 200-acre Topsfield farm into a rural showplace on the European model, with a main house approached by an avenue of planted firs and maples and surrounded by ornamental trees and gardens. While the Topsfield property was truly a retreat from city life, its substantial working farm with pedigreed cattle, specimen crops, and orchards of fruit trees also supplied the tables of the Crowninshield mansion in Salem. For a short period of time in the 1850s, the farm was known as the Boyden Stock Farm, with horses, cattle, and over 50 pedigreed Suffolk pigs. The next owner was Thomas Wentworth Peirce, and that's the owner who produced the farm that we see here today. Who first used his Newburyport Turnpike as a country retreat while living in Boston. A shipping magnate who had begun his career in New Hampshire and had moved his mercantile house, Peirce and Bacon, to Boston in 1843, he later increased his considerable fortune by investing in railroads. His first wife died in 1862, after which he apparently moved to Topsfield full-time, supervising the farming activities and participating in local agricultural affairs. By the 1870s, he had remarried and, having invested heavily in southwestern railroads, maintained residence in both Topsfield and San Antonio, Texas. In 1872, he hired well-known local carpenter Jacob Foster to transform his Topsfield house into the 3-story Second Empire mansion you see here, and to build a new stable. In addition to the enlarged country mansion and stable, the transformation of the old Crowninshield country retreat to an up-to-date gentleman's farm of the late 19th century, complete with model dairy, involved the construction of a large cluster of specialized outbuildings. Based on professional landscape plans by the eminent landscape designer and engineer Ernest Bowditch, the design landscape around the main house included picturesque walks, ornamental shrubs and trees, and formal gardens. At the same time, state-of-the-art drainage systems were installed on various parts of the property. From 1873 until his death in 1885, Colonel Peirce also leased the Essex Agricultural Society's Treadwell Farm, and that is where the Topsfield Fairgrounds are today. That was bequeathed to the Essex Agricultural Society by Dr. Treadwell. He died in 1850s. I can't remember exactly. I'm sorry. It was located just north of his property, and of course adjoining, so he could easily send his farmer down there as well, where he expanded experimental farming there. These drawings, not really drawings, are from the 1884 Atlas of Essex County, and there's wonderful characters of the important properties around the edges of the maps. Thank you. The 1910 layout shows that Peirce's elaborate development had been maintained in this rural retreat. We're looking north here. This is Garden Street, right here, and there is his estate, and that is the right here is the property on the east side of the turnpike. On the farmstead across the turnpike from his house, Colonel Peirce built what is reputed to have been the largest cow barn in Essex County, along with at least 2 smaller barns, an ice house, a blacksmith shop, and a manager's boarding house. In 1880, the manager's house was occupied by Peirce's farmer, but also by his family, 12 farm hands, a housekeeper, and an Irish-born gardener. Full house. Today, of the farmstead on the east side of Boston Street, the farmhouse, some stone walls, and the foundations of the outbuildings are all that remain. Back to Lake Village. From the 1830s, Eleazar Lake Jr., who we met very briefly when we were in Lake Village before, and his brothers, Joel and William, ran a successful nursery business known as Topsfield Nurseries. Hundreds of varieties of apple, cherry, peach, pear, and plum trees covered Lake Hill that rose behind the lake houses on River Road. Ornamental and fruit trees were sold on Exchange Street in Boston, locally and through catalogs. The holdings of 1850 demonstrate the wide variety and large quantity of plant material. Nursery stock included 700 apple trees on 7 acres, with 6 varieties of winter apples and winter apple trees and 11 varieties of fall apple trees. The nursery exhibited 102 varieties of fruit at the Essex Agricultural Society Fair, and throughout the 1850s and 1860s, they won many prizes in fruit and other nursery categories. Also in the 1850s, the Topsfield nurseries began to raise evergreen trees as the interest in ornamental landscaping was taking root. In the 1860s, the next generation, Charles H. Lake, who was the son of Eleazar Lake Jr. and had been born at 93 River Road, took over the Topsfield nursery business and in 1866 built his Italian dwelling on Prospect Street at the top of Lake Hill, which you see here. Well-known local housewright, John H. Potter, constructed the dwelling to go with the barn, which he had built on the property a year before. The barn is no longer there. Orchards covered the hill and extended down to River Road and across on the south side of the road as well. At the same time, Charles's brother, Henry E. Lake, carried on farming and orcharding at the Findling homestead, 93 River Road, into the 1880s. He had 200 apple trees in his orchard and grew crops of potatoes and corn and raised a few cows and pigs, enough to accommodate the family and send produce to market. This property on Prospect Street became a rural retreat in the 1870s when Charles Lake sold the property to Richard Price and Octavius Shreve, both of Salem. They improved the house and grounds into a lavish country estate, which they named Four Winds. An example of a newcomer building an estate on a smaller parcel was Percy Chase, the Boston banker, who built his rural retreat on Prospect Street, opposite the one we just looked at, in 1899. Mr. Chase and his wife, who lived in Brookline, purchased a 9-acre parcel on which they built their house, and a companion stable was built a little bit later in 1902. The Chases also owned a 22-acre pasture adjoining the house parcel on the east and fronting on River Road. Although the architect of the shingle-style cottage is unknown, the style and elaboration represented popular trends of the day. In 1928, John L. Saltonstall, who we'll meet in a bit, who by then had established his estate on River Road, purchased this property to add to his large land holdings and really to accumulate all of the property on the north and south side of River Road. And in fact, Saltonstall moved to this house, lived here, after selling his estate in the 1940s. Two of the largest country estates that survive today were established in 1898 and 1899, and I regret that I thought last night, I should have gotten a picture of these two gentlemen to have here, but instead you have to look at the layout of their properties. Bradley Webster Palmer purchased the old Lamson Farm at the east end of town and turned it into a 3,000-acre rural retreat on this side. His estate was rivaled only by that of another new arrival, Thomas Emerson Proctor. Both Proctor and Palmer hailed from Boston. Both had graduated from Harvard in the 1880s, one at the beginning, one at the end of the decade, and both remained bachelors, eventually retiring to Topsfield, where they lived until their deaths, Palmer in 1946 and Proctor in 1949. Bradley Palmer was a founding partner of the noted Boston law firm Palmer & Dodge. Thomas Proctor dabbled in business and was a beneficiary of his father's amassed fortune from the leather business. In the 20th century, these two gentlemen alone were largely responsible for the preservation of both vast areas of land and many historic structures in both Topsfield and Ipswich. Many of these turn-of-the-century newcomers participated in farming and the development of crops, agriculture, horticulture, and livestock, with contributions to the Essex Agricultural Society and entries in the yearly fair. These two gentlemen were no exception, and both joined the society immediately upon establishing themselves in Topsfield. And as early as 1899, Proctor won first prizes for his Berkshire boar and his Berkshire cow. Proctor's estate, which began with his 1898 purchase of the Dudley Bradstreet Farm on Perkins Road, and included subsequent purchases of surrounding parcels, such as the Dr. Henry Sears estate in 1901, ultimately covered over 4,000 acres. A mansion house was farther along on Perkins Road, and the footprints of many of his holdings can be seen on these two 1910 atlas pages. that the property that you know today as the Audubon Society is on the right, at the end of the lane there, and you can see the circulation routes that they developed all around their property. And his big house that he lived in was up here on the way to 153 Perkins Road. Does that make sense to you? I think it was the War Farm is up here.
What road is it?
Oh, Perkins Road.
Perkins Road.
Perkins
What's the other
Road.
one?
This is Perkins Road here. Up here is, oh, I need help. Is that as far up as this way?
Still part of Perkins.
Yeah, it's still Perkins Road.
That's still Perkins Road. It goes like that, and that's Howell. And that's Howell, yes. I'm sorry.
April.
Right, yes. And there, this is Perkins Road comes up from the bottom here like
Right.
that, and then it turns. Okay?
The number would be about 136, I think. It's just opposite.
I was trying to think of the number of the, I mean, I know it's 153. I think it was the Poor Farm, and it's a white house.
Oh,
It's very
yes,
close to the road, and it has a
yes.
beautiful barn.
Yeah,
That property is right there.
right.
So I was just trying to orient you on
Oh.
the map, that's all. Okay, let's see, where are we here? For some time at the, we can turn to the next one. Thank you. Some time at the turn of the century, Proctor lived in this mid to late 18th century Bradstreet farmhouse, which had been the farmhouse of the Bradstreet family for nearly 140 years. Proctor and his mother moved here while he was amassing his surrounding land holdings, which we just looked at, and adding to this property so that by 1908, there were 12 outbuildings on this property alone. Both Thomas Proctor and Bradley Palmer invested vast sums of money in indigenous and imported ornamental plant material. Thomas Proctor set a goal to plant a specimen of every hardy North American tree on his estate, where his arboretum and rockery gained wide recognition. The rockery was designed by a Japanese landscape architect, and glacial remnants from both Newbury and Raleigh were brought here to build it. The rockery is on the far right. Following the advice of Charles Sprague Sargent, he searched in the Far East for exotic plant varieties to add to his collection. And in the rockery alone, he planted Douglas fir, Korea mugo, dwarf Alberta spruce, and cork trees. Over the years, he maintained a network of carriage trails, which we saw in one of the last slides, on his estate, which were open to the public so that all who wished could enjoy these landscape features. And it's also interesting to note that Sargent, who was the director of the Arnold Arboretum at the time, also made frequent trips to Glen Magna, where he advised his good friend William Endicott on plantings at the Peabody Endicott Farm, which is today Glen Magna. William Endicott had married a Peabody, and that's how he came there. Now, as noted before, Bradley Palmer came to Topsfield about the same time and also bought another farm, the old Lamson property, of which only the farmhouse remains. From the 1910 atlas, which you see here, we can see Palmer's early laying out of his estate, which was modified throughout his more than 40 years later. A major change occurred in 1925 when he shifted, or actually relocated, Asbury Street by building a new bridge over the Ipswich River and carrying the road away from his property. The new entrance gates were built about the same time at the location of the old road. So that the...
There's a pointer up there. Are you right here? Oh.
Oh, thank you, okay.
Asbury Street?
So this is Asbury Street coming up here, and now it goes straight up like that to Ipswich Road. But when he first arrived, it came this way and made a turn farther east on the river to come across the river. So that the house that he bought was the Lamson house was in here, and then he started adding these other things. And the only things that you see added here are what he had done up to 1910, and then he kept going. So this is only his first 10 years there. Palmer's mansion was this is the Lamson house, which now is vacant and boarded up, was on the old road. It is reported to have at its core an early Lamson structure from the late 17th century that was added to a number of times to become this Georgian house and former farmstead. Palmer's mansion was constructed in 1902, much from the local stones of the fences and the walls on the property and along Old Asbury Street, in this craftsman style with English Revival influence. The architect was Charles K. Cummings. We want to remember that name because we're going to meet him again. The siting of the house on the top of the hill overlooking the Ipswich River and at the end of the winding driveway employed important landscape and architectural tenets of the day. The house was organized in a U shape and had many fine details in oak and cherished finish, stained glass, tiled floors, and fireplaces. And if you are looking for something to do, drive right up to the door, and it's absolutely a marvelous, marvelous door. It has so much detail on it. You can go right up the road in the Bradley Palmer State Park and right up to the around the circle that you see there. Palmer took the park-like approach as evidenced by a letter from him in 1905, which asked for a couple of carloads, that's train carloads, of rhododendron as an experiment. Many of his bills of sale from nurseries throughout New England show the large quantities and varieties of plant material that he was adding to his Topsfield estate. He also communicated with nurseries in Scotland, where he traveled, and he recruited a head gardener, William Keith of Aberdeen. I might add too that your Historical Society has just a wealth of information on these two estates and their bills of receipts and their, all of the plant material. You can read about everything that they were buying. It was really an exciting find when we were doing the research. Topsfield also continued to draw new wealthy families from Boston, Salem, Lynn, and other North Shore cities in the early 1900s. Most of them purchased working farms and converted them to summer retreats with a farming component that was not only maintained but often expanded. William Niles of Lynn, for instance, purchased and remodeled part of the Towne Farm on High Street in 1904. He moved the house up onto the top of the hill and remodeled it in the colonial revival style. North of the house was planted a colonial-style perennial garden with sundial as a focal point and a low picket fence. Now it's Valley View Farm. Also, the street, across the street, the Towne Farm was converted to a 1920s agricultural estate by Malton resident Ichabod F. Atwood, who with his wife established their country seat, which they called Newtown Farm. In the process, they expanded the old farm to 130 acres. Although the Atwoods were summer residents, they raised cows, sheep, and horses and joined the Essex Agricultural Society by 1927. A striking feature here was the addition of an outdoor room or a garden lot on the northwest side of the house. Here. Enclosed by a high stone wall and featuring a stone well structure at the middle. Remnants of the orchard and the arrangement of the farm buildings are also of note. Here we see the barns of these two farms, which used to be one, opposite one another. At 29 Cross Street was the farm of Daniel Bixby, which took on its country retreat characteristics in the 20th century, but only after being firmly established as prime farmland on the south side of the Ipswich River. The younger Daniel Bixby lived on the Cross Street farm at the time of the American Revolution and reported that he was in the fields when he heard about the outbreak of the war. He left immediately for Lexington and subsequently supplied the Continental Army with beef from his farm. Bixby added to his farm so that by the early 1800s he owned all of the land bordering on Cross Street between Raleigh Bridge Street on the west and Hill Street on the east. He willed his farm to the town as the donation farm, the income from which would help to support the congregational ministers of Topsfield. This arrangement continued until 1871, when the property was sold to Isaac Morgan, who had just returned from California, and he renamed the donation farm Riverdale Ranch. So you have had one ranch. Although this Cross Street farm was to become a rural retreat in the 20th century, it retained its significant farming tradition, which was enhanced by the next owner, the real rural retreat owner, J. Morris Meredith. This Boston realtor, who started the well-known firm of Meredith and Grew in 1891, purchased the farm in 1899. Meredith maintained livestock on his farm, including several horses, a small herd of up to 16 cows, several pigs, and a flock of chickens. And he was a member of the Essex Agricultural Society. And I show this in the form of the circle. If you drive in, you come to the farmhouse, the 18th or 19th century farmhouse first, and then the ice house, and then there's a garage, and then the large barn, and then the smaller barns, and others around it. It's all on a semicircle off of Cross Street. In 1900, J. Morris Meredith built his arts and crafts house behind the farming complex. While Meredith called Topsfield his permanent home from 1902 to 1920, he clearly was among the class of those who sought out retreats in Topsfield. He had begun his career with some high-profile real estate transactions at an early age. In 1875, he formed the Copley Trust with a number of investors, purchased the old Museum of Fine Arts building, and eventually built the Copley Hotel. He also was the broker for the sale of the Amos Lawrence estate in Newton's Chestnut Hill area to Boston College. In 1891, when Meredith established his firm, Meredith and Grew, with partner Edward Wigglesworth Grew, he expanded the business to real estate management and formation of trusts to hold real estate. It's interesting to note that although Meredith called Topsfield his primary residence, he must have retained his Boston home at 66 Beacon Street because he returned there in circa 1920 when he turned the farm over to his nephew. This was Edward Wigglesworth, who lived in Boston on Chestnut Street and was the director of the Boston Society's Natural History Museum. Wigglesworth took an avid interest in the farming and developed a nationally recognized Guernsey herd. Under his proprietorship, most of the outbuildings in the farmstead complex were constructed, including the ice house we saw before, the garage, a small cow barn, and attached wood stave silo. He, like many of his rural retreat colleagues, was a member of the Essex Agricultural Society and went on to be the president in 1928. Mr. Wigglesworth continued to call Meredith Farm his summer residence until 1944. And the tradition of raising fine specimen cattle at Meredith Farm was perpetuated by the mid-20th century owners, David and Irma Lampert. They developed a breeding business with their foremost Ayrshire herd, and in 1950 received the International Grand Champion Cow Award for Talisman Emerald's son, Trinket. By the late 1950s, under the Lamperts, the farm had grown to 250 acres and supported a world-renowned herd of 140 Meredith Ayrshires. While farming was an important component of many rural retreats, some new owners came to Topsfield to establish rural retreats that became showcase properties that did not include farming. Such was the case with the large summer cottage, which we've already seen, built by the Percy Chases of Boston on Prospect Street. Other examples on Salem Road. In 1905, Malden residents Arthur H. Wellman and his wife purchased farmland to construct a country estate designed by Stickney and Austin. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that, well, I think I did in the beginning, that there are a huge number of architects that were coming through Topsfield designing these properties. Wellman was an attorney in Boston in his own firm, Wellman & Wellman, and also served in the Massachusetts legislature representing Malden in the early 1900s. In 1910, James M. Marsh of Lynn, owner of the Goodwill Soap Company, built his architect-designed estate next to the Wellmans, also on Salem Road. Like several other early 20th century owners, Marsh and his family had summered in Topsfield for a few years before purchasing property. When the time came to develop their own country seat, the Marshes purchased land from David Pingree II, then owner of the Perkins Pingree Farm. And this was the area known as Pingree Hill on the east side of the Newburyport Turnpike, just south of the Topsfield Fairgrounds. Each of these summer estates was carefully sited with fine views over meadows and well-planted with rhododendrons, mountain laurel, magnolias, and flowering borders. And in 1905, George and Annie B. Shattuck of Salem purchased an old farm and subsequently hired architect William G. Rantoul to transform it into a gentleman's farm. No, I shouldn't have used that word because Mr. Shattuck isn't there for very long. Then it's run by women. They greatly expanded it in 1907 and operated a renowned dairy farm here for many years. The large gambrel-roofed, stuccoed country house was their summer residence. Shattuck died at an early age in 1915, and his wife and daughter operated the dairy farm until the 1940s. The garden behind the house is designed as a 2-level grass terrace with a low fieldstone retaining wall. A perennial garden is at the base of the wall, as are a bench and bird bath. And they have nice detail, which is probably lost on these slides. Sorry. And also a playhouse, which later served as a studio, appears to have been very nicely taken care of or reconstructed. One of the most substantial country retreats was established for Margaret Cummings of Boston in 1909. Miss Cummings purchased a parcel of land at 82 River Road, which became 82 River Road, that had been part of the lake property and on which a Lake family cemetery remains. She had her architect brother, there he is, again, he's the one who designed Bradley Palmer's house, Charles Kimball Cummings, design her estate, which included the house and a garage in the Tudor, that's just the house, I'm sorry, in a Tudor Revival style, as well as a small brick pump house located down at the end of a meadow near the Lake Cemetery. Like most of the rural estates in this part of Topsfield, which were oriented to the Ipswich River, the layout took advantage of the distant view of the river from the brick terrace at the rear of the house. For his sister's country property, Charles Cummings recommended a domestic scale and a picturesque treatment rather than the more formal and monumental styles that were popular at the time. This is evident in the final design of the buildings as well as the treatment of the grounds. Although Miss Cummings continued to live in Boston into the 1930s, she was intimately connected to the Topsfield community. She was distinguished as the first woman member of the Essex Agricultural Society and participated in its events. She maintained gardens, crops, and orchards on her Topsfield estate, which she named Innisfree. The only reason I bother to tell you that is because this is possibly named after the Innisfree of William Butler Yeats' well-known poem, Lake Isle of Innisfree, which romanticizes the notion of creating an idyllic place, and I think that's just what she was doing here. Although the summer social registers account for her winter residence as 300 Commonwealth Avenue in Boston into the 1930s, Miss Cummings did become a registered voter in Topsfield beginning in 1927. Almost immediately after construction of the buildings, Miss Cummings' landscape architect Arthur Shercliffe developed a landscape plan for the estate. The outline of the perennial garden and the garden pavilion are still extant, conveying a sense of the many different aspects of estate landscaping. Miss Cummings continued to add to her estate with the construction of in 1922 of the gardener's cottage, in the lower right, so called by her brother, who designed the bungalow cottage. Eventually, it became the house of Miss Cummings' secretary, Margaret Fritten, who lived here until 1967. The terrace steps leading from the terrace at the rear of the house down towards the river are bordered by remnants of the orchard, and at the bottom of the hill is the lake cemetery. You can see the edges of it there, and a small brick pump house designed by Cummings. Also on the estate was a tea house constructed in 1927 and augmented in 1929 by a sunken garden. The interior of the diminutive garden house was embellished with raised field paneling and Delft tiles, no doubt to romanticize the colonial style. It was demolished in 1997. The sunken garden, designed by Robert Nathan Cramp of Boston, remains here. You can see the edges of it, with stone wall, iron filigree gate, and general outline of the flower borders. And if you stand up on the terrace and you look off to the east, you see these borders. You see open land, and then you see borders that are heavily vegetated with flowering trees and very, very tall, flowering bushes, I'm sorry, and very, very tall pine trees that border the next estate we're going to look at, and sort of separate them from the view and keep your view focused on the river. James Duncan Phillips and his wife, Nanny Borden Phillips of Salem and Boston, had summered in Topsfield at the new Pingree Mansion on Hill Street for several summers before purchasing over 100 acres of farmland across the street. Here they built their country seat in 1911 and 1912. Phillips had descended from another prominent Salem family who also had made fortunes in the shipping business. An 1897 graduate of Harvard, he was the vice president of Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company and a renowned historian who wrote articles for the New England Quarterly and the Essex Institute's historical collections. While the Phillips retained residences in Salem and Boston, they developed their farm as a model dairy farm and prominent rural retreat. They hired prominent Boston-based architectural firm Putnam and Allen to design their large summer mansion as well as other buildings on the 100-acre estate. Like the gentleman farmers before him, Phillips was a member of the Essex Agricultural Society and participated in the annual agricultural affairs. And this is the rear of the house. This is not the entrance. And I really show this because of the prominence of the terrace that is at the rear of the house, supported by this very high stone garden wall. The outbuildings, too, were part of that 1911 and 1912 construction. A barn for 6 horses, several cows, and a hayloft, a garage for 2 cars, a tenement for the chauffeur's occupancy, and an ice house. And the arrangement of those buildings is the most fun for those of us who do this for work. When we get to a property, we can see the way the buildings are all put together. And a small summer house, or tea house, in a garden marked by low brick gates was situated below the high wall surrounding the terrace at the rear of the house. One of the largest in size and the grandest in taste of Topsfield estates was the 20th century country home of John L. Saltonstall on River Road. Early use of the property was by the Lake family, who farmed most of the land along River Road, which we've talked about, in the 18th and 19th century and built several houses. In 1920, Mr. Saltonstall of Beverly purchased what was known as the Webster Estate, and it was called Webster Estate then for Albert Webster, who had bought the, we'll see in a minute, the cottage on the property and summered there, and he was a candy manufacturer. John Saltonstall, a Harvard graduate of the class of 1900, was the son of William Gurdon Saltonstall and Josephine Rose Lee Saltonstall, and first cousin of well-known Massachusetts Governor Lever Saltonstall. He was a successful stockbroker from 1903 to 1935, served in the Navy during World War I, worked for the War Trade Board in Washington, and while living in Beverly, served on the City Council and as the state representative to the General Court. The farm that Saltonstall purchased included several nearby farms on the north side of the Ipswich River. The main property had the circa 1760 Lake Bradstreet cottage with several outbuildings clustered around it on and near the site that he had chosen for the new mansion. So Saltonstall relocated the cottage to its present site, which we'll see a little more clearly in just a second, in front of the western wing of the main house, and had other buildings moved or removed in preparation for the construction of this Georgian Revival country house, designed by Philip Richardson of Richardson, Barrett, and Richardson, a Boston architectural firm. The architect had designed a number of houses in Chestnut Hill near Saltonstall's maternal home and on Beacon Hill in Boston. The setting of his new farm overlooking the Ipswich River reminded Saltonstall of Virginia's estates overlooking the James River, hence the design of this large rural retreat in brick with a central block and flanking pavilions. Interior spaces were enhanced with features preserved from the Saltonstall Howe House, which had been built for an ancestor of his in Haverhill. That house had been moved and then eventually demolished in 1906, in 1919, and somehow Saltonstall had taken some of the interior features and was able to reuse the grand staircase and paneling for his new dining room and drawing room in his Topsfield estate from that Haverhill house that was a family house. The landscape architect for Saltonstall's rural retreat was Harold Hill Blossom, who had worked in the Brookline office of the Olmsted brothers for 12 years on such illustrious projects as the San Diego and the Seattle expositions. Let me just take a minute here. These are photographs that, as you can see, from 1924. They were in various magazines, and they were, in fact, taken by Harold Blossom when he was working on the estate. And one of the important features is that the building was painted white at this time. This is the Lake Bradstreet Cottage, and I think it's yellow now. It was. And it has a little gambrel roof. It's just a wonderful small house, and it's situated right here, adjacent to the main house. In 1919, back to Blossom, who's the landscape architect, opened his own landscape architecture practice to advance his considerable knowledge of horticulture and ecology. Together, Saltonstall's two designers, Philip Richardson and Harold Blossom, turned the rural agrarian property with its cluster of small wood frame buildings into an estate displaying a fine blend of the formalistic approach to the house and its immediate surroundings and a pastoral approach to the overall setting. Saltonstall's development of this estate, in effect, promoted principles of preservation, whether intentional or not. As noted above, preserved the circa 1760 Lake Bradstreet cottage rather than demolishing it. And he kept it as a main feature in the setting next to his 1920s mansion. Other buildings were relocated and reused, and then the reuse of the interior features that I mentioned before were a very important aspect of his preservation of the past. Also, Saltonstall continued to assemble his large estate by acquiring additional surrounding farmland. 1923, the John Balch property, which is 9 River Road. 1928, the Percy Chase property on Prospect Street, which we talked about, including that 22-acre pasture, which is directly opposite the driveway to the Saltonstall estate, and you all call the Saltonstall estate the Coolidge estate. And I continue to refer to them by their first owners rather than the owners that you know. It's interesting to note that Saltonstall spent, and his wife spent summers and many winter weekends at their Topsfield retreat. And during their winter visits, they actually stayed in the small cottage rather than in the big brick main house. Saltonstall's appointed estate was well received according to the magazine Architectural Record, which in its November 1924 issue published photographs and reviewed the architecture with the following praise: the perfect relation between central block and the subordinate wings, the excellent fenestration, the window patterns, and the beautiful detail have produced not only a skillful piece of design, but a house of genuine charm without affectation. It is a byproduct of good architecture and good taste interacting upon each other. I'm sure the architect was very pleased to see that review of his work. Other publications also applauded the design of Saltonstall's estate. House Beautiful published an article titled "The Modern Country House After the Southern Colonial Style," and on and on. There's several other examples. In 1940, the Saltonstall estate was sold to Frederick R. Sears III of Palm Beach, Florida, and Mr. Saltonstall moved to that Prospect Street property that we discussed before. In 1948, the Sears estate, now the Sears estate, Saltonstall Sears estate, was sold to Sears' cousin, William Appleton Coolidge. Mr. Coolidge was a 1924 graduate of Harvard, served in the Navy during World War II, and worked as a stockbroker, lawyer, and later in business. He hailed from an aristocratic family, much like Saltonstall, He was a direct descendant of the first settler of Watertown, John Coolidge, and was directly related to President Thomas Jefferson. Coolidge was a large contributor to Topsfield institutions and at one period served on the local finance committee. He was a substantial donor to the Essex Agricultural Society, financed the construction of Coolidge Hall at the fairgrounds in 1981, donated a corner of his land for the construction of the Topsfield Episcopal Church, and made major donations to the Historical Society. He also continued the tradition of preservation of the rural character of this unique area by purchasing the adjacent Cummings estate when that came on the market in the late 60s, and then Meredith Farm in the 1970s, thus joining under common ownership nearly all of the land bordered by River Road on the north, Cross Street on the south, Salem Road and Hill Street on the east, and Raleigh Bridge Street on the west. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Coolidge also continued the tradition of farming this land and conducted experimental farming projects, particularly at Meredith Farm. In 1984, Coolidge deeded Meredith Farm to MIT, granting life tenancy to the Lampreys. And upon his death in 1992, the rest of Mr. Coolidge's property, including the River Road estates, was bequeathed to MIT, which sold all of these former Coolidge properties in 2000, as you know. And he is buried in the Lake Cemetery. Almost at the end here. The Essex Agricultural Society, should have started out with this, which continued to hold its annual agricultural fairs in various locations throughout Essex County. Remember, it was started in 1818, and then each year they would have a fair, and they would go to a different town in Essex County. Well, by the early 20th century, they were finding it extremely difficult to find the right location because the fair had grown and grown. And they decided, since they had the Treadwell Farm, which they received in the 1850s, to develop the farm into a permanent location for the annual fair. This decision was based upon concern for the viability of that farm, and then also, as I said, the increasing difficulty in finding the right location. And they also believed that permanent buildings would enhance the fair's quality and success. It was still known at this time as the Cattle Show and Fair, later became the Topsfield Fair, and the first annual fair at the permanent location was held in Topsfield in 1910. So here you have some of the first buildings. The buildings were added throughout the years that we just talked about. Coolidge Hall in 1983. But this is the Grange down here in the bottom right corner. I think this is the fruit and vet, or else the flower building. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly. And then I love the one of the 10th, which was an early fair. I think that was in the 1920s, when some of the buildings were up, but not enough. So they pitched the tents for the various buildings. So that is that. I have lots of information about the various architects and landscape architects. I won't be able to spill it out to you, but I have it all here. It's in the National Register nomination and in the context statement. And if I've made any wrong statements, correct us. We need to know the right material. And there's loads of research projects to think of if anybody wants to find out more about any of these topics. Thanks.
For Margaret, and she had to go attend the planning board meeting. Elizabeth Mullen, member of the Topsfield Historic Commission, and I've been working with Gretchen on this project in the last nearly 10 years, 9 years. This just pulled it together for me. I've been reading the material, and there's piles of it. But to have someone come and pull it together like that tonight, it was fabulous. And I got to thank you again for that. Terrific refreshments over there, some wine, cider, cheese maple. So I would love you to go ahead and take part of that. If you have questions for Gretchen, come back and sit down. We can talk some more and get some questions. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.